Several years ago, we did a film on the battles, and we had it installed.
Traveling west from Tarsus, Paul and Silas would have been confronted with the Taurus Mountains, which separated the coastal plains around Tarsus from the interior regions of Cilicia, Galatia, and Asia Minor. They would have had to travel through a treacherous pass known as the Cilician Gates. The Cilician Gates are a series of narrow gorges cut through the Taurus Mountains. The peaks of these mountains can exceed 12,000 feet and have been a harrowing challenge for travel, trade, and military excursions for centuries. The Hittites, the Mongols, the Greeks, the Romans, the Crusaders, all these great armies had to make their way through these tight passes that separated east from west. Today, the Gulek Pass has been conquered by a modern highway. This modern highway here in Turkey that runs from Tarsus to Ankara. Now, Paul and Silas would have taken a narrow, treacherous path through this great mountain barrier, but since this is only a half-hour show and I may or may not be more spoiled than they were, I want to take the 70 miles to Derbe and Lystra on 6 lanes of divided highway. As we've learned in prior episodes, the Romans built a vast network of stone highways around its empire. They were durable, flood-resistant, often guarded, and wide enough for soldiers to march 6 abreast. It's been said that if all the roads from Rome were linked end to end, they would circle the earth twice. These are the roads that Paul and his companions often traveled, and the roads that provided relative security. However, just off the Roman highway system was another world altogether. More often than not, Paul and his team would have to travel these secondary roads where safety or even survival was uncertain. Flash floods, wild animals, marauding bandits were all known perils of traveling these ancient roads. And as for me, I'm just happy to work the word marauding into this show. So, back in the 1st century, in the eastern Mediterranean, these back roads were only passable during the summer months, when the streams were dry and low. During the late winter or early spring, travelers had to navigate raging rivers and sometimes makeshift bridges, so drowning was a real hazard. Worse than rivers, though, were the robbers and thieves, since people tended to travel with pretty much everything they own, including silver coins. Travelers made prime targets. Perhaps the scariest peril of all was the wild animals. I mean, at least a robber might leave you alive, right? Apuleius, a philosopher and poet living a few decades after Paul, wrote about the wild boars, bears, and wolves that roamed present-day Turkey and Greece, and how travelers often journeyed in fear, especially through forest areas. Apuleius wrote this: "We were told that the road we wished to take was strewn with half-eaten corpses and clean-picked skeletons, and that we ought to proceed with all possible caution and in a compact body with no stragglers. The higher the sun, the milder the wolves." In one of his letters, Paul wrote this: "On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure." 2 Corinthians 11, 26 and 27.
All right, good morning, everybody. Let's try that again. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, it's awesome. Everybody having a good week so far? All few hours of it. Did anybody realize how rough it was? Like trying to, that's like worse than going to Memphis right there. All that Paul had to deal with was trying to make these journeys as we go into this. I just remind you, do have a podcast. If you're wanting to catch up, you can go to the Spotify page with Campbell Street, get access to all the classes that we did last semester. And what will we call it? Like October? October will be sort of at least into this new material. So if you're new to the class, you can sort of get caught up with the first 13 chapters of Acts as we go into the new material as well. I'll show this to you again. These are some of the many resources that we are using. Highly recommend if you want to get just one of these that's actually easy to read, unlike the 1,700 pages in that 2-volume series that you have to have some little bit of Hebrew and Greek knowledge of, and it's mind-numbingly difficult to get through, but every now and then there's this really useful bit of information. The Untold Story of the New Testament Church, highly recommend that if you want to do some further reading. First got that book like 20 years ago, and it was like a little small book, and the guy has revised it over the past 2 decades, and oddly enough, it just came out in April, his revised version, right when we decided we were doing this class. So super helpful and timely. It's now like double to triple the size it used to be, but excellent read as we get into Galatia. Remember, when you're talking about real people, real places, there's a real context that we've got to understand as we're trying to pick up real plans that God has put in place to bring all people back to Him. Here's our map. Let's catch us up on sort of where we have been and where we're going. You can also see an estimated time frame here of how long Paul is spending in each one of these cities. We're going to start this week, and we ended last week in Paphos and Cyprus. And then they're going to head to Perga. Okay, Perga's right there on the coast. It's the port city of the city of Antioch. There's something like in the neighborhood of like 15 different Antiochs back in this time frame. So this is the city of Antioch. And then once they finish up there, get kicked out of there, they head through the rest of the Galatian territory. Okay, Galatia was just like a state or province. If you had to sort of equate it to Tennessee, of course, it waxed and waned over the years, but it's somewhere a little bit more than 1.2 times the geographic area of Tennessee at its height. Maybe a little bit bigger than that, to somewhere in the neighborhood of about half the size of Tennessee at its lowest point. So interior part of Asia at the time, modern-day Turkey, very mountainous terrain as well. And after Iconium, they're going to head to Lystra and Derbe. Derek's going to get into next week what happens in these locations. To catch you up with some things last week that makes this sort of interesting, how Paul wound up there. Remember, while they were in Paphos, they meet this Roman proconsul, Sergius Paulus, and he becomes the first reported Gentile by name, convert that Paul has. Remember, too, we've got these names that we see begin to switch place in Acts chapter 13. His Hebrew name is Shaul, okay, which is Saul in the English, of course. It's Saulus in Greek, which doesn't have a really good connotation, okay? So it was real common for the educated, sort of upper-class Jews at this time to have a Hebrew name they used when they were amongst people who spoke Hebrew, their brothers. And then they had a Roman name as well. Okay, especially if your name translated into something sort of weird, you definitely want to have another name that you could go by. What possibly might be going on here as well, given this name Paul, when he's around Sergius Paulus, who seems to accept Jesus, and there's this adult adoption that takes place during the Roman time frame, that you could adopt somebody who meant a lot to you or might help out your family, and you wanted to help them out. And when you did that, they would take on your name, and they would take also the protection that your family had to offer as well. So possibly this is what's going on too, and why Paul adopts Sergius Paulus's name. Regardless, Guess where Sergius Paulus' family is? The city in Antioch. Okay? They found like archaeological evidence of stones there marking the family estate. So not only does history prove that Sergius Paulus was this Roman proconsul in Paphos, but you see where his family was from in the city in Antioch as well. So maybe, just maybe, if this guy has accepted Jesus, he's so excited about this good news that he's like, hey, my family, they're all in the city in Antioch. Can you go tell them about this? They need to hear this good news as well. And then Paul himself writes in Galatians, and this is part of the mirror reading of the epistles that we're going to do. And let me stop just for a second, because Derek and I were having this conversation right in class. Has anybody ever read Acts or read the epistles through the lens of Acts before and tried to sort of time it and sort of make sense of it, sort of what we're trying to do? John sort of nodded his head, like maybe sort of, because Derek and I were like, maybe it's just us, but we've never seen this done before. Nobody's ever tried to explain the Bible. Okay, fantastic. Because it's such an, I think, an important way of doing it. I'm learning that I'm just going through this. Like, this is a throwaway verse right here. I mean, how many times have you read this? And maybe you remember reading it, maybe you don't remember reading it. And now you're like, well, it sort of makes sense. Maybe Paul got sick in Paphos. Tells the Galatians, I came to you because I was sick. Anybody ever caught that before and made sense of the timeline and what's going on here? So again, we're going into Galatia. He's telling them, hey, I came to you because I was sick. Paphos is in that coastal area where malaria is important, so possibly, just possibly, maybe he wound up with malaria. And if you go up into elevation, a lot of times there's going to be less mosquitoes in that area. The climate's a whole lot better. It's not as hot as down when you're in the coastal area, so it's a better opportunity, place to recover. One of the important things here as well, because of this, okay, in the Jewish culture, if you're sick, that's viewed as a curse from God. Okay, it's harder to trust somebody or accept somebody if they visibly have a defect or have an illness, because it's viewed as God. That's part of the cultural context that Paul's going to be dealing with too, as he's in the city in Antioch, and going to the Jewish synagogue, and possibly one of the reasons it plays into them not wanting to listen to him, rejecting him. So what about this journey? John Mark takes off with them, and then John Mark said, I'm done. I didn't know y'all were going into the mountains. It's dangerous there. I'm heading back to Jerusalem. It's a 186-mile by sea journey, and it's not the nice little cruise ships that people like to do in the Mediterranean now when they do this. This is a treacherous voyage. Very possibly, this is one of the times Paul notes that he was shipwrecked. Okay? We certainly have one of them when he's near Malta. It's going to come up later in Acts, but this possibly could be this other where he was fighting for his life in the open seas. So they get to Perga. Again, I mentioned this is one of those key port cities for the city in Antioch. Big city, about 100,000 people living there. It's one of the Roman province capitals. Pamphylia, very large amphitheater in that area that seated about 14,000. Typical type of Roman city you would expect: the nice market, the agora, baths, gymnasium, fountains, all those wonderful things that you would enjoy. And then from there, straight up into the mountain. Okay, you saw that introduction video. Sometimes 12,000 foot tall mountains in this area that now Paul and Barnabas begin to go through these Taurus mountains, roughly 130-mile journey, depending on which roads they took. This is a very dangerous journey as well. Sometimes the roads might look like my AI thing had drawn there, and sometimes you might get lost. The roads as you get out into the less civilized areas are much more difficult to travel. Plus, you're dealing with things like bandits, people that might want to kidnap you, and lions and tigers and bears, swollen rivers, things of that nature make it really difficult the mountain. And Paul again notes this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 as well. All things that he has had to go through to bring the good news into these areas. Antioch Pisidia, fantastic place to live. You're nice up in the mountains, about 3,500 feet above sea level. Nice and cool. It's beautiful. You can look out and see all these foothills. This is built as the new Rome was built on 7 hills. Big temple to Augustus in the middle. Had a big amphitheater too that might come into play later in this story as we get into this. And of course, the typical Roman things you would expect, like the Roman bathhouses, mineral baths, theaters, things of that nature too. Nice aqueduct in the area that would bring water in to the fountains. Because this was a key military and administrative center, you would have a lot of leading officials in the area, like Sergius Paulus family, that is obviously present in Paphos, the main part of the family being here, part of this administrative system. So if Sergius Paulus had done that adult adoption of Paul, and he sends him to this area, at least to some degree, he's going to be under the protection of the family. Okay? And that might play into a little bit how the Gentiles begin to take the faith on as the Jews reject it, but at some point even they could not protect him from what happens in Antioch Pisidia as he gets kicked out. It's a very diverse population here as well, major trade hub as well, all things coming in. And so this is where we're going to see the kingdom community being planted in this city, this major hub of what's taking place. So I'm going to be real careful about how we use the phrase church. Notice I use the word kingdom, which I think most closely explains the term ecclesia. Everybody's heard that term, ecclesia, right? What's the meaning of ecclesia? How do we translate that? Call out. Okay, so that's right. Technically, both of them are right. Technically, it's the call out, okay, or an assembly. We tend to translate it, though, as church. And there's a different word, the Kyriakon, that we derive the church from. The Kyriakon is actually just a structure, and then it's translated into Old Germanic languages and Old English, the Kirke, and then it comes down to us, modern English, church. And Kyriakon is never used in these contexts, okay, because this is talking about a building. Ecclesia is talking about people, and that's a community. Does that make sense? And it's a cultural thing that we have. I'm going to church. Building, going to be with the community and people. And so I'm going to try to be real conscious when we set up this picture of what Paul's doing, building these little communities of people, Jew and Gentile, people from all these different cultural backgrounds and social backgrounds who are living together in community. They're just not heading off to a building. In fact, they don't really even have a building, as we'll delve into this and see. So let's read this. Shannon, let me start with you, and then we'll just go back till we get all the.
Paul and his company set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, but John left them and returned to Perga. They journeyed on to Antioch. On the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat. After the reading of the law and prophets, the synagogue officials sent word to them, saying, "Brothers, if y'all have any word of exhortation."
Remember, I'm using the southern version, so Paul's going to sound really southern. He's in southern Antioch, southern Galatia.
Paul stood up, motioned with his hand, and said, "Men of Israel and those who fear God, y'all listen. God of this people Israel chose our ancestors. He made them prosper during their stay as foreigners in the land of Egypt, and he led them out of it and with an uplifted arm. For a period of about 40 years, he endured their habits in the wilderness, and after he had destroyed 7 ethnic groups in the land of Canaan, he gave the land for an inheritance."
This all took about 150 years.
gave him Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin. After removing him, raised David. God testified about him. I have found David, the son of Jesse, man after. From this man's descendants, God has brought the Savior Jesus, just as he promised.
For Jesus' public entrance, John preached the baptism of repentance to all people. As John was completing his mission, he said, "Who do y'all suppose that I am? Not the one. This coming after me, not worthy of my sin. Sibling, go preach those among God. The word of this salvation is sent out from God."
For the residents of Jerusalem and the rulers don't know him, and by condemning him, they fulfilled the sayings of the prophets that are read every Sabbath. Though they found no cause for death, they still asked Pilate to have him executed. When they had completed all that was written about him, they took him down from the tree, and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and he was seen for many days by those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are his witnesses to the people.
We proclaim to y'all the good news of our ancestors, as children, by raising up Jesus, as it is also written in the second Psalm, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And regarding that, raised him from the dead, never to return to decay. He has said, "I will ensure blessing."
Therefore, he also says in another song, "Do not allow your Holy One to see decay." When David had served God, his own generation, he fell asleep, was laid with his fathers, and experienced decay. The one God raised up did not see decay. Therefore, known to God, siblings, that the goodness of sin proclaimed to God.
Through him, everyone who believes is justified from all the things which ought not be justified from through the law of Moses. That's why we all must watch out what is spoken in the prophets does not happen. More one perish, for I am doing work in y'all's day, work that y'all never believe, even if someone declares it to y'all.
They were leaving the synagogue. People heard them speak about these things. The synagogue had been dismissed. Many of the Jews, God-fearing proselytes, followed Paul and Barnabas, who spoke with them, urged them.
The next Sabbath, almost the entire city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. They began to contradict the things that Paul was saying, and they Philip.
Paul and Barnabas spoke out. It was necessary that the word of God be spoken to them first, since indeed you reject yourselves the life. Now turn to the dead. This is what he told us. I have set you as a light, that you should bring salvation to the
When the ethnic groups, Gentiles, heard this, they began to rejoice and praise the word of the Lord, and all were appointed to eternal life to believe. The word of the Lord was spread throughout the entire region.
So the Jews decided that prophet God-fearing women from the men of the sick and servants and threw them out of their the Paul and Barnabas shook the dust off the feet against them. And the disciples were filled.
All right. A lot of stuff there. What did you notice? Caught your attention. We'll go to the thing. What caught your attention?
the resurrection.
What now?
Preach the resurrection.
Preach the resurrection.
But the passage was not.
Yeah.
That didn't say what my Bible app says.
Uh-huh.
They had to become your father, and so I was reading, I just said it, because I've been hearing it, but then I was lost.
Yeah, the translation.
Yeah.
You know, just small. Say this, but you said he took them out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And I just have been. Red Sea. Yes.
Yeah,
Those are-
exactly.
I mean, that's one of those little things you just, all of a sudden, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I've read this out how many times before. It's brand new. These little teeny tiny things. Like that. Let's try to,
I think it's interesting how just the week, it gives a sermon, and by the next week, so, you know, the whole city's out there to hear you, just think, love that book, you know, like, what's going on for these 7 days, gets the whole city up.
yeah, we'll try to imagine that. I think there are some key things.
The similarity in human nature that killed Jesus, the jealousy is here. Chasing them.
And when we say Jews, don't have the context of every single Jew in the city, have the context of Jewish. There's a lot of scholarly debate about how that word Israel should be translated, and most scholars think it's Jewish leaders. Some of your translations actually may use that. But he does exactly what we're going to continue to see him do. He heads into the synagogue as soon as he gets there. Okay, and he talks about this in Romans, Jew first, and the Gentile. Okay, so that's going to be the pattern. We're going to see this pattern continue to be used and established when he goes into these areas. Did you note that term, God-fearer? Isn't that too? Have you heard that term before, God-fearer? What does that mean? Yeah, that term. We're going to see this show up a good bit in Acts 2. We already have. So there was a group of Gentiles that were just referred to as God-fearers. Okay, they had attached themselves to the monotheistic religion of Judaism, and they hadn't gone all in. They hadn't gotten circumcised, done all those things, but they would go to synagogue services. They would give alms like Cornelius did. They would do some of the moral laws. I mean, even Sabbath observances, even some of the dietary customs and things of that nature. They just hadn't gone all in like the circumcision thing. And that's going to become a big issue as we get to Acts chapter 15. Why Paul winds up actually writing the Galatian letter. Okay? So very well, in this area, we may have an answer to Paul's thorn in the flesh. Okay? Sometimes people think, well, he had bad eyesight. He had something physical going on. And I'm sure Derek and Greg, when they get into this a little bit more and investigate that thorn in the flesh thing, a lot of times that sounds like another man fighting against him and inciting the Jews and following Paul around into these areas with another group of Judaizing teachers that ultimately has to be resolved in Acts chapter 15. Or what are we going to do with these Gentiles who don't want to be circumcised and have full observance of the Jewish law?
Now,
All of that starts into this area.
how many years after death of Christ did this take place?
So this is in 47 to 49 AD, right here.
About 15.
Yeah, and the Jerusalem Council is supposed to be in late 9.
Well, there's still, this whole passage refers to assembling and teaching, preaching the Sabbath,
No,
and there's no reference to the first day.
not at all. Okay.
And you would think by this date, the first day of week worship and
late in Acts, he's going back on the high holy days and traveling back to celebrate some of these festivals he's supposed to. We're going to talk about that in just a second because that's going to be very important to help you understand sort of the cultural context. But this scripture too refers to what's been done since the Babylonian exile. Okay, it's called the Parashah readings. Every week, and this is the one from yesterday, the Torah, every year, did you know this? Every year the Jews read through the entire Torah. Okay, it's like, if I got up today, I'm supposed to do the Lord's Supper thing today, if I got up and read Deuteronomy 7:12 through 11:25, and had you stand for that, one, that's going to take me about 30 minutes. One, y'all are going to be zoned out after about a minute into it. Okay, but this is what they do, and there's now a biblical record of this has been going on. So 2,000 plus years, we know exactly what they're reading on any given day. Okay, and not only is it attached to the Torah, there's something called the Haftarah, okay, which is the prophetical words. So you read the Torah and you follow that with a Haftarah that has something to do with that Torah reading. Fascinating that the one for yesterday just barely missed the verse in Isaiah about being a light to the Gentiles, about verses or something like that. And it goes into and takes into account the suffering servant theme that's in this chapter, this section of Isaiah, right before you get to Isaiah 52. Okay. So they're reading this stuff every day, or at least every Sabbath, actually 3 times during the week. You do the whole thing, unless you're in the triennial reading, which is a whole other rabbit hole. But it's also very common. We could do this today, Johnny. If you had a visitor in the synagogue, just invite them to get up and speak. So let's look for the person who's a visitor at church today and invite them to get up. That's what's going on there. They're sitting around the side on the bima, and they look out and say, that guy looks pretty Jewish. Let's get him to get up and speak. He looks like he's probably a Pharisee. He's dressed really well. He's like super Jew. We know we can probably trust what he's going to say. Let's get him up and speak. So in fact, this is probably what they would have looked like. Okay, they've got the tzitzit on the bottom that's commanded by the law. They've got the beards. It would be unkempt. They would have the tail, the shylocks, the side locks. It would be common. It was commanded by the law as well. They've got the tefillin or phylacteries that are on their arms and on their head as they're going into this worship service. Okay, so you look around and like, guys, dude, yeah, he's going to give us a good message. He's keeping the law like we're supposed to. Let's get him to get up and speak, give us a word. He's a visitor. He seems really well educated. Okay, so Paul, as an observant Jew, would be doing this stuff. Okay, that's one way he buys into the culture. And what does he say? To the Jew I became a? To the Gentile I became a? He could work within these cultures to achieve what he needed to achieve. If you look like this and you're walking around town, you're easily identifiable. Okay? People are going to know you're set apart. You're proclaiming what you believe by the way you look. We don't always do that people in our culture. All right, you still see this today. If you go to Israel, some of the places in the United States that have large Jewish culture, phylacteries, the tefillin, and prayer. Paul's going to get up as he gets ready to give this speech that he's asked to do, spur of the moment, and he's honestly going to mimic a whole lot of what Stephen said 15 years ago. Remember, Paul was there, talked about this when we did this chapter on Stephen. They gnashed their teeth at Stephen because of what he said. Paul's probably gnashing his teeth too. He's a young man at that point. But this has registered with him, and probably for the last 15 years since he heard this and he did what he did at Stephen's death, he's probably wanted to make amends. And here's an opportunity again to do this. Did you notice too, it mentions John the Baptist here? Now this is like hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. And Paul just throws out the John the Baptist reference like they would have known what was going on. What do you make of that? would they have known John the Baptist, right? What do you think? Somebody probably emailed somebody back then or sent a TikTok video. Hey, look at this crazy guy out in the...
They would have come back to Jerusalem.
Exactly. Exactly. We got references in Acts chapter 2 that people from this area were there. So, word of mouth. Right? They're talking about this stuff. That's why when a visitor comes, you see somebody who's not normally part of your community, hey, tell us what's going on in the outside world. Get up and give us a word. And that's what they've asked him to do. And then he makes this reference to Psalms chapter 2. Okay? At least 7 times in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in Acts 2 times, Hebrews, and in Revelation, this psalm is quoted. So it's a pretty important psalm. You take a second and read the whole thing there real quick. Because Paul lifts, you are my son, today I have become your father. Where in the world does this talk about Jesus or the resurrection? Because he's tying it into the resurrection. What's this psalm talking about? And it is talking about Jesus, but Paul does something really interesting with it. Not necessarily talking about the resurrection. What's this psalm talking about? How's it used in Revelation if you connected those dots? And this is why it's important when you see something, when Paul throws out these references in the Old Testament, go back and look at the sources.
Is this recovering?
Jan's hit it. That's what's taking place here. Remember that spiritual battle, spiritual warfare we set out all the way back at the Tower of Babel when the nations were divided up to these spiritual forces? Paul's going back to this. He said, that's exactly right. And I'm here for this very reason. God's recovering his people. But that verse that he uses and ties it to the resurrection, did Jesus only become God's son at the resurrection? What does Paul mean there? People could read that into it. That he wasn't a son until he was resurrected, then he became a son. What's he saying? How do we interpret it?
Didn't God call him the son at his baptism?
He did? Yeah. Yeah, so he's been the son all along, and the resurrection just validated. It didn't initiate it. It validated the sonship to the entire world. Called him at the baptism, but you bring somebody back from the dead, that's validation. And that's what's taking place here. And you can go all the way into Romans, and Paul uses the same language, references this verse in Psalm chapter 2, and defines it further for you. It says he was appointed the Son of God in power according to the Holy Spirit by the resurrection from the dead. So it's validation. Okay? You've done everything I've asked you to do. You've been my son all along. You're back. Validated. This is the Messiah. Does that make sense? All right. Psalm 16, he quotes this too. I didn't put the whole thing here because it's a bit of a longer psalm. I'd encourage you to go back and read it on your own. But the verses that he's quoted, therefore my heart is glad, my tongue rejoices, my body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faith see. Okay. Does anybody know what this is? I got to do the Lord's Supper talk here in a few minutes, and I'm going to actually do it on this.
Shroud of Turin.
Shroud of Turin. Yeah. What do you know about the Shroud of Turin?
That's it.
That's it.
It's supposed to be the burial cloth Jesus was wrapped.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I will admit I've been a Shroud of Turin skeptic for like most of my life, and then several years ago I went to the Bible Museum exhibit in Washington, D.C., and they had a whole exhibit to this, and I was like, that's really interesting. And so I'm going to share a couple things with you. I'll expound upon this a little bit more. So this person who was buried with this apparently is 5'10", 5'11", 170 to 180 pounds. If you're curious, Tucker Carlson's an interesting character, so not advocating all that Tucker Carlson talks about, but he did have a podcast in the Shroud of Turin recently that caught my attention because I've just got a few things that, like streams that stuff to catch my attention. So I went running one day, just listened to this, and I was like, that's fascinating. Looked up some of the stuff to make sure it wasn't a typical Tucker Carlson thing, that the guy actually proved what he said to some degree. So if you will listen to it, that's there. But here's what it shows, and that's the negative of the facial image. That was taken in 1898, actually, by an Italian photographer. And when he was developing it in the negative room, y'all remember when you got film cameras and you got the negative? The guy looked at it and he literally said, "Oh my God," and it wasn't because like saying it in a bad way. It was because, "Oh my God," like literally could have been the face. So what it shows is 700 different wounds. There's this image of a helmet of thorns, not necessarily a crown. You got your nail wounds. You got a gash between ribs 5 and 6, and then they've analyzed the what appears to be blood stains on it, and it's type AB blood, which is a rare type of blood, period, but more common among Semitic peoples. What's fascinating is nobody knows how this image was formed. And there have been artists that have tried to replicate stuff like this and do certain things, and it's never quite turned out just right. Physics labs have looked at it, and like the image that's burned in is like 2 microns thin, okay, and it's linen. And they say it takes 34 billion watts of energy in 1/40th of a billionth of a second to do something like this. And nobody's been able to replicate it. The jolt of somebody back to life. A body that did not see decay. I don't know. So, fascinating though. This line, Paul works in here. Anybody of the belief that all sins are exactly the same? I think I was taught that growing up. All sins are the same. You're nodding your head, smirk. So you were taught that too? Raise your hand if you're taught that. Like half of you. Is that right? Does God view all sin the same? No. Which ones are? How do you know that? Let me ask you. Which one? How do you know that, Johnny?
Talks of 7 deadly sins of the 8.
Okay.
You know, sins have different ramifications, and that in itself makes them distinct. In other words, you know, sometimes sins have generational impact. Sometimes they have societal impact. Sometimes they have eternal. You know, they wound the conscience in a way that another sin doesn't quite, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different ways that they're not the same.
Yeah.
Every sin requires the death. You know, if you sin, you die. Every sin is Christ. The substitution. Every sin is the same. But there's a lot of ways that they're different.
Yeah, so remember he's talking to a bunch of Jews, and you hit on some of the key points. Talking to a bunch of Jews who's used to the sacrificial system, and he says this, there's some things that can't be justified from, and immediately they like, he's talking about the death penalty sins. Okay, there's something like 14 of these that you do, pick your one. There is no sacrifice for that sin except you. Okay, you remember the other stuff, you go do a dove, you go do a cow, you do lamb or
What
whatever.
sin did you say?
Huh?
What you said, that sin, there's no sacrifice.
These sins, there's no sacrifice for, except for you. You got to be sacrificed.
There's no sacrifice for sin.
Yeah, those are all considered willful sins.
It's in a lot of ways, not just those. David's sins, obviously.
And he should have died.
There were no sacrifices.
Right. So they get this when he says this, and then think about your average Gentile that's in the community. They know what the Jews believe. They They know they've done some of this stuff. They've done idolatry. They violated the Sabbath. They maybe have been involved in homosexuality, adultery, witchcraft, sorcery. And the Gentiles who aren't God-fearing, no, I got no place with them. I've got a history of this stuff. I just keep on worshiping my false gods. At least I can do what I want to do there. No hope for me anyhow. This is why this is good news. Because this message gets out into the community. And these people who were lost because they've been involved in that stuff, they're like, this is fantastic. Let me hear more. And there's an amphitheater in Antioch, Pisidia, that holds somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 people. It's really packed. Okay, 5,000 can do it easily, but could hold almost the entire population of the city. Antioch, Pisidia, again, not a huge place. Everybody could pile in that amphitheater and listen to Paul preach this. And then it says this, as you read. Anybody pick up on this? All who were appointed to eternal life believe.
Sounds like destination.
It does, Chris. What's going on there? Paul teaching us predestination here? We're going to proof text a verse. We're not going to proof text, but we're going to proof text. I can turn to this one and proof text predestination. How do you explain this in the context of the Old Testament? Here.
Romans 8:29 has kind of a list of verbs, and the first one is those he foreknew, he also predestined. The idea that his knowledge is outside of time.
Yep, exactly. And if you take this all the way back to Babel, the story of Babel, he's going to have a faithful remnant from every nation. And part of that is his foreknowledge and his who's going to accept. Okay, not predestination in the classical Calvinist viewpoint of things, but God knows what you're going to choose. Okay, and he's doing his thing, fixing the mess that occurred at Babel. Take the remnant of every nation. All right, and as we wrap this up, we get into another story of, I know that's sort of funny the way I did that. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul talks about what he was, Dave, you love of what is going to happen to Paul here. Typically, when you're expelled from a Roman city, and he must have done something so bad that the Sergius Paulus family was supposed to watch over him. Even their power and authority of the area could not protect him at this point. He angered so many people of power. And so it was common in the Roman expulsion that as they're driving you out of the city, teach you virtually. Okay. Very likely this is the time that occurred. Driving out of the city. And then it ends with this. So the disciples in the city, the good news coming into Galatia, it takes hold amongst some Jews who choose to follow Jesus as the Messiah, and a large group of Gentiles who say, I've got hope now. I've done these things that I should die for. But there's this Jesus person who died for me so I could have eternal life. And they're filled with this joy and with the Holy Spirit. So let me leave you with this. Are you? Can you say the same thing? Is what we see here in Antioch, Pisidia, with what Paul throws down as the stranger asked to get up and speak in the synagogue, how he tells the overarching story of what God is doing and relates it to his plan of putting everything back the way it's supposed to be at the beginning. Does that leave you with a sense of place? Can we be like that? Any questions, comments, thoughts? We got like 2 minutes.
I wonder how perceive us presenting the gospel out, or perceive this.
Man, that's a good question. Judge probably could be at the time. But when you see the cultural context of what's taking place, it's hope. Done all this stuff. I can be rolling in God's family. I don't have to put the phylactery on before that. I can still eat my pork. We got to work that out later. We got a few more chapters to go before that gets worked out.
I read this morning, primary emphasis is good news. God is the secondary. We should receive. And we can, at times we flip it. Make the gospel is what we should do. Receive it. So we just do.
So remember too, as we go down here, Paul's maintaining his Jewish. This is an extension of his Jewish faith, and that's going to become very increasingly important as we work through the rest of the facts. How he's going to these places, being all things to all. How he's the apostle to the Gentiles, but yet every time he rolls into the Jewish synagogue, and they accept him as one of the. He looks like that. He can roll like that. And that's part of, I think, sharing the gospel effectively, too. Is being all things to all people, rolling. Not isolating yourself to be with people who are just like you, just like you. Big message to them. Wouldn't it have been fascinating to know what his speech was when he got it in that answer? Wish that was exciting. All right, everybody have a good rest of the week.
Today. Is that my cup?
Yes. Yep, that's